The grief in Elias Thorne's hands was an old, familiar weight. He pressed his palms against the cold window frame of his homestead, watching the twilight bleed across the snow-swept plains. 45 winters had carved their lines into his face, but this one felt like a final, unyielding frost. A silver gray had started to map its way through the dark bristle of his beard, and his shoulders stooped as if carrying the physical burden of a headstone. 3 years prior, he had laid his wife, Ilara, to rest beneath the solitary cottonwood that wept toward the creek, its branches bent in a permanent state of mourning. Since that day, a profound silence had settled over Elias, not from an inability to form words, but from the stark absence of anyone worth speaking them to. The cabin itself was a vessel for her memory. The shawl she had woven still draped the back of a rocking chair he refused to occupy. On a high shelf, a collection of dried herbs she had gathered sat untouched, slowly surrendering to dust. He remained a faithful occupant of his side of the bed, though the other half had long ago lost all warmth. There had been a daughter once, a fleeting dream who never drew her first breath. After that loss, Elias ceased building cradles. He turned his hands to constructing fences and mending worn leather, his world shrinking to the perimeter of his land. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones, the silent man who rode in for supplies once a month, his words as sparse as the coins he traded. Some speculated that sorrow had unhinged him. Others believed he had always been a man apart. That evening, as the sky deepened to a bruised purple, a sound broke the stillness, something alien to the whisper of the wind, a faint, struggling cry. His first thought was of a wounded coyote dragging itself across the frozen earth. He stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held in a grip born more of habit than any real sense of danger. And then he saw her. She was a crumpled form in the snow near the cedar by the barn, curled into herself as if the wind had painstakingly sculpted her from despair. Her dress was ripped at the sleeve, the fabric darkened with blood from her shoulder to her wrist. Her feet were bare, and she was young, possessing the same stillness as the deer he sometimes hunted in the leanest years. For a long, suspended moment, Elias simply stared, the way a man confronts something his mind refuses to accept as real. Then slowly, he lowered the barrel of the gun. He did not ask for her name. He did not question her origins. He simply moved forward and lifted her into his arms, his movements careful, as if he feared she might disintegrate at his touch. She was lighter than his own sorrow and smelled of river water and wood smoke. Crossing the threshold of his cabin with her felt like ushering a storm indoors. He gently laid her by the hearth, wrapping her in the only blanket that was not saturated with memories of Ilara. She stirred, a faint murmur escaping her cracked lips, spoken in a tongue he did not understand but felt resonate deep in his bones. Comanche, perhaps. He hadn't seen any of their people on these lands for many years, not since the soldiers had swept through, driving them away under the banner of progress and peace. But this girl, barely 20, had the haunted look of someone fleeing something far more personal than soldiers. He filled a basin with warm water and tenderly cleansed the blood from her arm. A deep gash marred her skin, serious but not fatal. It had bled enough to leave her weak, but the wound itself was clean. With the quiet proficiency of a man who had stitched flesh in another life, before the war, before the homestead, before everything had been stripped away, he began to close the wound. She watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, flinching only once as the needle pierced her skin. He remained silent. She offered no sound in return. When he was finished, he stepped back outside to wash his hands in the snow, letting the biting wind clear the heaviness from his chest. The moon was ascending, casting long, skeletal shadows across the prairie. His gaze lingered on the cedar tree. It had been Ilara's favorite. Every spring, she had planted wildflowers at its base. They had not returned since she was gone. Inside, the girl had shifted closer to the fire, her breathing shallow but even in sleep. Elias stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, before moving to his own chair by the hearth. He did not attempt to sleep. He did not watch her. He simply stared into the dancing flames, his mind drifting back to the last time he had shared this room with the sound of another's breath. He assured himself she would be gone by morning. But morning arrived, and she was still there. She awoke before the sunrise, sitting bolt upright with an alertness that spoke of ingrained fear. Elias had left a piece of cornbread and dried venison on a plate beside her. She reached for it with the swift, wary motion of a cornered animal. He sat at his table, sipping coffee, his presence a neutral territory, not ignoring her, but not intruding either. When her eyes finally met his, they held no plea, no gratitude, and no demand. There was only the uneasy quiet of a truce between two strangers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a gravelly echo from disuse. "For now." She did not reply, but she also did not flee. The snow began to fall again that day, thick and relentless. Elias went about his chores, tending to his livestock, breaking the ice in the water trough with the slow, methodical rhythm of his solitary life. When he returned to the cabin, he found that she had swept the hearth and neatly folded the blanket. He saw her gaze drift toward the cupboard, where his meager supplies were stored. Hunger was a silent language, but it etched its story onto a person's face. That night, he prepared a stew of beans, salted pork, and wild onions. She ate with a slow, deliberate grace, as if each bite were a ceremony. He observed that she chewed only on one side of her mouth, and he suspected a bruise was hidden by the dark curtain of her hair. He did not ask how she had been hurt. She did not volunteer the information. The storm intensified as night fell, the wind howling around the cabin like a grieving spirit. He stoked the fire and offered her the bed. He took the chair for himself. It wasn't an act of kindness, he told himself, but one of practicality. The bed was warmer, and she was mending. That was all there was to it. He was jolted from a light sleep in the dead of night to find her standing by the window. Her silhouette was a sharp cutout against the flickering firelight as she scanned the dark horizon, watching for someone or something. He rose with a quiet groan. "Are you expecting trouble?" She turned, her eyes truly seeing him for the first time. A long, fragile silence stretched between them. Then she gave a single, resolute nod. Elias had faced trouble in many forms: war, famine, and the profound ache of loss. But this felt different. This was not his trouble, yet it had already taken root within the walls of his home. He crossed the room and retrieved a blanket. "You'll stay the night. We can sort out the rest when the sun comes up." She looked at him with an unreadable expression. It was not trust, not yet, but the fear had receded. He returned to his chair, rested his head against its worn back, and listened to the fire crackle as the wind battered the cabin. Something inside him had shifted, an unnamed change in the emotional landscape of his solitude. The silence no longer felt like mourning. When the first pale, pink light of dawn filtered through the shutters, Elias went out to feed the horses. He hadn't seen any fresh tracks for weeks, but this morning his breath caught in his throat. Hoofprints, dozens of them, formed a tightening circle around his homestead. He lifted his gaze to the ridge and saw them. Riders, their faces painted, the tips of their spears catching the nascent sunlight. At their head, a figure sat tall upon his horse, a dark cloak billowing around him like wings. Comanche. Elias's chest constricted, not with fear, but with a sudden, cold understanding. He turned slowly and walked back to the cabin. Inside, the girl was standing by the fire, her eyes wide, but not surprised. He said nothing. She said nothing. And in that shared stillness, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. Neither of them was safe, but neither would run. Not anymore. He'd lived on this land long enough to recognize when the world fell silent in the wrong way. The morning birds had not sung their songs. No rabbits scurried from the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Then he saw the shimmer, a faint ripple in the distant air. Unsettled dust. The sound followed, a low, rhythmic thunder of approaching hooves. He didn't move at first. He placed his cup on the fence post with deliberate care, as if a sudden movement might awaken some ancient slumbering force. Then he turned and walked back toward his homestead, his boots making a soft, crunching sound in the frosted snow. Inside, the girl stood by the hearth, tightening a strip of clean linen around her mending arm. Her dark hair was loosely braided, and a newfound alertness had replaced the fear in her posture. She was not afraid. She was ready. "They're here," Elias stated, his voice flat. She looked up, her already wide eyes seeming to gaze at something far beyond the cabin walls. He reached for the Winchester rifle mounted above the door, but his hand paused and then fell back to his side. A rifle would be of no use to him now. He stepped outside again, and this time she followed. The riders crested the low ridge like a wave of earth and bone, a fluid, silent motion. There were dozens of them, 60, perhaps 70, all mounted, all moving with a chilling quiet. Their approach was not a charge, but a reclamation. They rode as a single entity, their formation tight, the snow muffling their hoofbeats. Leading them was a man cloaked in black wolf fur. His face was streaked with red paint that resembled tears of war running down his cheeks. Feathers stained with ochre and ash were braided into the mane and tail of his horse. His expression was as unreadable as ancient stone. He halted his mount a dozen yards from the cabin, and his warriors formed a wide, encircling ring behind him, surrounding the homestead without a single weapon being raised. The girl stepped forward before Elias could speak. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with an undeniable clarity. "Father," she said. The man on the horse remained silent, his gaze sweeping over her before settling on Elias. Elias stood his ground, his arms loose at his sides, his feet planted firmly. He offered no explanation. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between them. He simply watched, trying to decipher what this man saw. A broken-spirited white man in a cabin filled with ghosts, standing beside his daughter. The silence stretched on, long enough for the wind to stir again, whispering around the edges of the silent gathering. Then the father spoke, his voice a low, solemn rumble. "You sheltered her." It was not a question. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. The Comanche leader dismounted, the snow groaning beneath his boots. He walked forward with an unhurried authority, the way a man might walk into a battle or a sacred ceremony. He stopped just a few paces from Elias, close enough to strike, close enough to see the lines of sleepless nights etched into each other's faces. The girl moved to stand between them. "I chose not to return," she said quietly, but with a certainty that required no amplification. The warriors remained motionless. Elias did not move. The father's dark, ancient eyes flickered to his daughter, then back to Elias. "He had crossed into the land of spirits, and you breathed life back into her." "I didn't give her anything," Elias replied, his voice steady. "She took it back herself." The girl's father studied him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, not softening but recalibrating as he took the measure of the man before him. His hand rose slowly. Elias tensed, but he only reached out to touch his daughter's chin. "You are not a child," he said to her, "and yet I wish to decide for you." She did not flinch from his touch. "I did not run from you. I ran from men who took what they had no right to take." The words landed in the cold air with the force of silent thunder. The leader looked away, his gaze sweeping over the vast prairie behind Elias's homestead, a landscape scarred with a history of blood, broken treaties, and sorrow. He turned back to Elias. "My warriors will not strike you today." A subtle wave of relief passed through the girl's shoulders, but Elias did not relax. He could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air. "But they may return," the father continued, his voice dropping lower. "And not in peace. You have 3 days. Then I will come not as a father, but as a chief." He mounted his horse in a single, fluid motion. There was no dramatic turn, no shouted command. The circle of warriors turned with him, their horses moving like a tide pulled by an unseen moon. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind only the churned snow and the fading thud of their departure. Elias stood watching until the last silhouette had vanished into the haze of the horizon. He exhaled, a shallow breath that did little to ease the tension in his body. Inside, the cabin had grown cold, the fire having burned down to embers. He tossed more wood onto the grate, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The girl was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face a mask of unreadability. "You should go with them," Elias said, his tone not unkind. She looked up. "And go where? Back to a life of silence? Back to being married off to a man who sees me as nothing more than a name on a treaty?" She paused, her voice softening. "You gave me a room that didn't have a lock. That was enough." He turned his attention back to the fire, needing something to do with his hands, finding it difficult to look at her for too long without feeling something shift beneath his own skin. He did not yet know what to do with that feeling. 3 days. He counted them like grains of sand in an hourglass, each one a choice between losing her and keeping her. Later that evening, as the wind howled down the chimney, Elias sat by the window, a mug in his hands, his thoughts wandering dangerously close to places he had long since boarded up. Across the room, the girl was weaving a strip of leather, her hands moving with a practiced purpose. It might become a pouch, or it might become a story. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not with desire, not yet, but with a sense of wonder. Of all the souls who could have washed up on his doorstep, why her? Why now? She caught his gaze. She didn't smile, nor did she look away. "You do not fear them," she stated. "No." "Why?" "I have already lost what most men are afraid to lose." She nodded slowly. "I have not, but I have come close." The fire crackled. In the distance, a coyote yipped. "I will not ask you to keep me," she said, her voice low. "But I will not leave unless you make me." He truly looked at her then. She was not soft in the way Elara had been. She did not possess an easy lightness or a ready laugh. She carried the silence of storms and the stubborn resilience of something determined to grow in scorched earth. He didn't tell her to leave, he didn't tell her she could stay, he simply stood and stoked the fire once more. She returned to her weaving, and the world turned one breath closer to whatever was coming next. Outside, the tracks of 70 horses remained etched in the snow, a warning, a promise, or perhaps a mark left by the hand of fate itself. And somewhere deep in Elias's chest, something that had long been dormant began to stir, as quiet as the wind before it begins to sing. The next morning arrived muted and pale, the sky a thin sheet of linen stretched over the horizon. The snow had softened, its brittle edge momentarily dulled. Elias Thorne stepped out into the hush, the weight of the Comanche chief's words like stones in his pockets. 2 days remained. He immersed himself in the tasks of a man with more thoughts than he knew what to do with. Feeding the horses, checking the tack, mending the wire on the coop. The girl Lyra moved through the cabin like a ghost who had decided to become tangible again. Her touch was light, her steps careful, yet never timid. He noticed how she undertook small tasks without being asked. She swept the hearth, cleaned his tin plates, and refilled the woodpile with an armful she had gathered herself. They spoke little, their words chosen with the scarcity of water in a drought, but the silence between them had transformed. It was no longer a wall, but a room they both inhabited. "What was your wife's name?" she asked, the first time her voice carried a clear intention. "Ilara," Elias replied, his voice as quiet as falling snow. She said nothing more, but later that day he saw that she had taken the old shawl, the one Ilara used to wear, from the back of the rocking chair and placed it, neatly folded, at the foot of the bed. She had taken another for herself. He found himself watching her more often, not with lust, but with a steady, unsettling curiosity. Lyra was younger than the years that were written in her eyes. There was a profound silence within her, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who had learned to listen long before she was ever permitted to speak. She had a way of observing animals that reminded him of Ilara, her head tilted slightly as if trying to decipher their silent language. One morning, he found her crouched by the coop, offering a scrap of biscuit to a hen that had once pecked his own palm raw. The bird took it from her gently. Later that day, he handed her a length of supple, sun-darkened leather. "Thought you might want to make something with this," he said. She nodded, then met his gaze directly. "Thank you." The words were soft, but they landed with substance. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, close but never touching. She sang once, a low Comanche lullaby, not for him, but for herself. It was a song of sand, wind, and smoke. He didn't ask for a translation. Some things were not meant to be carried across the bridge of language. He simply listened. He began to speak more himself, not in stories, but in fragments. She learned he had been a medic in the war where brother fought brother, and the fields bloomed red. He told her he had come west not in search of gold, but because the vast silence suited him. She asked no questions, a quality he found he appreciated deeply. One evening, he returned from town with supplies. Miss Agatha, the storekeeper, had given him a strange look when he'd purchased fabric and tea. Her mouth had pursed when he'd asked for a second tin cup. "Got company, Elias?" she'd asked, her tone sharper than the question required. "Someone passing through," he had replied. "Company ain't always good company." "She's not trouble," he'd found himself saying. "She's a Comanche girl," Agatha had whispered, as if the words themselves might curdle the milk on the shelves. Elias had paid and left without another word. That night, he laid the fabric on the table without ceremony. Lyra looked at it for a long time before reaching out to touch the blue cotton with a faint brush of her fingertips. She didn't speak, but her expression was close to gratitude. The next morning, he found her stitching it into a tunic, her handwork as precise as any machine. She worked by the fire, the sunlight glinting off the needle, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the window. "You expecting them back before tomorrow?" Sam asked. She nodded. "They will not wait." He did not ask if she was afraid. Later, as the clouds rolled in, he saddled his mare and rode to the canyon ridge overlooking the trail. He saw nothing, but he felt it. The tension in the air had teeth. When he returned, the cabin smelled of broth she had made with the carrots and pork he had brought back. She gestured for him to sit and ladled 2 bowls. It was the first meal they shared that felt less like survival and more like communion. Afterward, he stood by the hearth, watching the fire. She came to stand behind him, not touching, but present. "I dreamed of a river last night, back home. My mother was washing my hair. I had not thought of her in years." He turned slightly. "Is she gone?" Lyra nodded. "A sickness in winter. There was no medicine." His throat worked around words that wouldn't come. "You remind me of her. You listen the way she did, as if every silence is a sentence you are still learning to read." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said the only thing he could. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you." Something opened between them in that moment. The next day, he showed her how to shape rawhide into reins, and she taught him the knots used to bind sinew to arrow shafts. They worked side by side in the yard, the wind curling between them. It felt like building a language. That evening, she braided his horse's mane, humming softly. He watched her nimble fingers, and when she looked up and caught him staring, she smiled. The smallest curve of her lips that undid something inside him. She stayed by the fire longer that night. When she leaned her head against the edge of his chair, her hair brushing his arm, he didn't pull away. They sat like two shadows stitched together by warmth.
He wanted to say, "I don't know what this is, but it is more than silence." He wanted to tell her about the dreams he'd started having of Alara laughing, of holding his daughter, but he didn't. The next morning there were new tracks in the snow, closer this time. The time had run out. He watched from the porch as she stood by the cedar tree, her hand on its trunk, her eyes closed as if in farewell. "You think they'll take you?" he asked when she returned. "They will try. I could leave, ride with you, get you past the ridge." She shook her head. "If you run, they will chase harder. They will think you took me, that it was about conquest, not choice." His jaw clenched. "And if I tell them otherwise? They will not believe you. You are not one of them." He stared at her, the fire crackling behind him. "Then what are we?" She looked at him, her dark, wounded eyes holding something tender. "Maybe we are the language in between." That night, a storm of wind and dust raged outside. They sat close by the fire, their knees nearly touching. He told her then, finally, about his infant daughter, about the tiny, unmarked grave beneath the cottonwood, and how he couldn't bring himself to name her, because naming something made it real. She took his hand. Her fingers were rougher than Alara's had been, but warmer. "I think she lived," she said softly, "even if only in your dreams." He couldn't speak. He wanted to kiss her, but the moment asked only for nearness. They stayed in the same room that night, he in the chair, she on the bed, neither truly sleeping. In the dark, he whispered, "What is your name?" "Lyra." He tasted it on his tongue. "Lyra." She breathed in, as if she hadn't heard it spoken with such care in years. Outside, the final morning waited just beyond the edge of sleep. The morning brook without color, the sky stretched thin with ash and wind. The land itself felt different, no longer quiet, but like a drum skin pulled taut, ready to snap. The air was restless, each gust tugging at the world. Elias stood on his porch, a worn wool blanket over his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no need to guess. The Comanche would return today. The line had been drawn not with words, but with the silent circle of hooves. Inside, Lyra moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She braided her hair tightly and checked the bandage on her arm. She dressed not as a victim waiting to be rescued, but as a warrior bracing for what was to come. Elias watched her through the doorway. He didn't need to ask her plan. He already knew. She hadn't stayed for safety. She had stayed for freedom. He made coffee, his hands shaking just enough to spill a few drops. She joined him at the table, and they sat in the quiet, memorizing the stillness before it shattered. "They will want me to return," she said first. "Not just as a daughter, but because I left without permission. They see me as something that belongs to them." "You don't belong to anyone," Elias said softly. Her eyes met his. "That is not their way. A woman sheltered is a woman claimed. They will not ask why you helped me. They will assume they already know." He looked down at his calloused hands. "Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them." She looked at him then, seeing the resolve forged from sorrow beneath his quiet exterior. She reached across the table and placed her fingers over his. By noon, the clouds hung thick and low, swelling with an unnamed storm. The first rumble of thunder came not from the sky, but from the earth. The hooves were returning. Elias stepped outside, leaving the oiled rifle leaning by the door. This was not a fight of bullets. This was something older. The horses formed a line this time. A wall of riders in war paint and silence. At their center sat Chief Kale, his wolf cloak on his shoulders, his expression hard. His gaze found Lyra the moment she stepped out to stand beside Elias, her spine straight. Kale raised a hand, and the warriors dismounted, no weapons drawn. But their intent was a heavy presence. "You have had your days," Kale said. "Now she returns." "She is not property," Elias replied. "She is a daughter. That is not ownership. It is a bond. And when a bond is broken, something dies." "Then let it die," Lyra said, her voice steady, "if it was built on silence." A murmur rippled through the warriors. Kale's jaw tensed. "You speak like one who forgets her blood." "I speak like one who knows what happens when blood is all that binds you."
Kale approached, his eyes burning into hers. "You would stay with this man, who does not know our ways, who cannot speak to our dead?" "I would stay with a man who let me be," she answered, "who saw me before he decided what I should be." Kale's gaze shifted to Elias, and for a long moment, father and widower faced each other across an unspoken divide. "You took her," Kale said. "I opened a door," Elias answered. "She walked through it." "You love her." The words hung in the air. Elias looked at Lyra, then back at her father. "I lost everything I ever loved. I would not ask her to stay unless she wanted to." Kale's face shifted, as if he were listening to something beneath the words. Slowly he unhooked a ceremonial blade from his belt. He stepped forward and held it out, not as a threat, but as an offering. "A man does not win a daughter," he said. "He proves whether he will break beneath her weight or carry it with honor. We have a right. You will hunt with me, one deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, I will know the kind of man you are." Elias said nothing for a moment, then gave a single nod. As he turned to go, Lyra touched his hand, her grip warm and present. The two men rode into the low hills. The deer they found was a strong buck. Kale offered Elias the bow. Elias moved through the brush as he had in the war, without rush or force. When he loosed the arrow, it struck true. They brought the deer back as the rain began to fall, a steady cleansing rhythm. The warriors waited. Kale dismounted and stood before Elias. "You do not speak our words," he said, "but your actions say what your mouth cannot." Then he turned to Lyra. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, his voice heavy, "but you are not gone from my heart." He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then turned and walked to his horse. The battle never came. When the sound of hooves faded, Elias and Lyra stood alone in the quiet rain. The storm did not howl, it wept. Inside, she removed her wet tunic and wrapped herself in one of Ilara's shawls. He hung his coat to dry. The fire hissed. She approached him slowly. "You didn't flinch," she said. "I didn't know I had the choice. I was ready to leave. I would have let you." She stepped closer, and he let her. "I want to stay," she said. He reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was damp, but warm. "Then stay," he whispered, as if it were the simplest and most sacred thing in the world. And in that moment, the storm passed. Later he would remember the sound of the rain on the roof like a lullaby, and how her fingers found his, not in urgency, but in quiet trust.
They did not speak of forever. They spoke in touches, in glances, in breaths shared as the thunderclouds drifted away. Outside, the hoof prints slowly filled with water. Inside, the fire crackled, and two people who had been lost, not to the world, but to themselves, began to put down new roots together in soil softened by rain. The sun rose slow and honey gold, warming the frost on the prairie grass. For the first time in weeks, the sky was a clear, wide blue. The storm had passed, not just in the sky, but between them. Elias stood by the barn, a bucket in hand. His posture had shifted. He was no longer a man weighed down, but a man rooted. Behind him, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney in a steady ribbon. Inside, Lyra moved barefoot through the morning light. A quiet rhythm guided her now, a steadiness that had replaced her fear. She chopped herbs and folded linen, each movement her own, freely chosen. There was no fear left in her hands. Elias watched her from the window as she spread a blanket to dry. The shawl she wore was no longer Elara's. She had stitched new edges onto it, a strip of the blue cloth he had bought in town. It was her creation now, her life woven into it, the past respected, but not clung to. He turned from the window and picked up a small bundle. Inside was a necklace of 3 carved bone beads on a leather thong, like one his own mother had worn. He placed it carefully on the table where she would find it, a wordless offering. The road to town stretched dusty and sun-baked now. There was a matter that needed tending. He saddled the horse, and Lyra stepped onto the porch. "You're riding into town?" she said. He nodded. "They'll have questions." "They won't believe the truth," she said, looking toward the horizon.
They'll believe what they want. They always do. A pause. "Do you want me to stay behind?" he asked. "I choose to ride with you." He helped her mount, his hand brushing hers. They rode side by side, the wind tugging at their coats. As they neared the town, he could feel the weight of staring eyes. They dismounted outside Miss Agatha's general store. She was already in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her gaze flickered from Lyra to Elias and back again. "Well," Agatha said, "you brought her back then." Elias met her stare. "She's not cargo." Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but clear. "I am not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose." Agatha blinked, then stepped aside. Inside the store, a hush fell. Elias kept his chin up. He didn't need to look at Lyra. Her presence beside him was as steadying as the earth itself. They gathered their supplies. At the counter, as Agatha silently tallied the goods, Elias spoke, his voice quiet but heard by every soul in the store. "We'll be married come spring." A murmur ran through the room. Lyra didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked out, leaving behind the scent of sage from a bundle tied at her belt. They rode home slow, the setting sun painting the sky in gold and rust. When they reached the homestead, the light was a deep amber. That night, the fire burned low and rich. Lyra sat at the table, braiding a new length of leather into reins. "Will you miss them?" he asked from his chair. "Your people?" She thought for a moment. "Some, not all. I miss who I was before they told me who I had to be." "I know that feeling," Elias said, staring into the flames. She stood, crossed to him, and placed her hands on either side of his face. "You never told me what you wanted." He looked up at her, his eyes lined but clear. "I wanted peace. I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door." She kissed him then, a kiss that wasn't born of want or curiosity, but of settlement. It was a kiss that anchored something in him that had been adrift for too long. In the days that followed, they built a new rhythm. He taught her to shoot a rifle. She taught him to track a rabbit. They spoke often, not because silence was no longer comfortable, but because there was now joy in sharing it. The town's gaze softened over time. Miss Agatha began setting aside fabrics she thought Lyra might like. One evening, Elias sat by the fire, a small, unfinished cradle in his lap. He carved it slowly, with the same care he had once reserved for a child who never opened her eyes. This one was different. This one was for the new life blooming within the curve of Lyra's belly. She watched him from the doorway, her hands resting over herself like a prayer already answered. "You're different," she said. "How so?" "Lighter, like your shadow doesn't cling so hard anymore." He chuckled softly. "Might be because I don't have to carry it alone." Outside, the stars spilled across the vast prairie sky. The fire crackled. The baby kicked. The man carved. And the woman who had been hunted and silenced stood unbroken, beloved, and chosen. In the stillness, Elias whispered, "Some stories begin with fire, some with ash. Ours began the moment I opened that door." Lyra crossed to him, placed her hand over his heart, and whispered back, "And I walked in." And so they remained, two quiet souls who had once weathered their own storms, now wrapped in firelight, building a life not of conquest, but of consent, not of rescue, but of recognition. They had endured the long ride. They were home.